My name is Colonel James Harlan, United States Army, retired. For over 2 decades, I served as an observer and advisor in various joint programs between the U.S. military and our allies across the Indo-Pacific. One of my longest assignments was with the Armed Forces of the Philippines, AFP, embedded in training exchanges, joint exercises, and occasionally in the field during counterterrorism operations in Mindanao. I was never a frontline commander there. I was the guy in the back, taking notes, offering suggestions, watching how things unfolded through the lens of American doctrine. This confession isn't about classified operations or battlefield secrets. It's about a moment that shattered something in me, a realization that no amount of PowerPoint briefings or after-action reviews could prepare me for. It happened in a high-level conference room, somewhere between Honolulu, Washington, and Manila. Details blurred now, but the words are etched in my memory like shrapnel. Picture this: a secure room in a joint facility, perhaps at Camp Aguinaldo or during one of those bilateral strategic dialogues. Flags of both nations draped behind the long mahogany table, stars and stripes on one side, the Philippines' sun and stars on the other. Medals gleamed under fluorescent lights. On the American side, generals from Indo-Pacific, planners from the Pentagon, intelligence officers with folders thick as bricks. On the Philippine side, the Secretary of National Defense, chiefs of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and a handful of battle-hardened officers who'd seen real combat in the last decade than most of us had in our careers. The agenda was readiness, how to bolster the alliance amid rising tensions in the South China Sea. Reports on equipment shortfalls, budget constraints, the latest Balikatan exercise outcomes. Then, a 4-star American general, someone high up in the chain, known for his directness, leaned forward. The room was already tense. We'd been discussing casualty projections in hypothetical scenarios involving gray zone aggression or worse. He asked, calmly but pointedly, "What kind of military training do you provide to ensure your soldiers are ready to die for their country?" Silence. Absolute, freezing silence. You could hear the air conditioning hum. Pens stopped scratching, eyes darted, then fixed on the table. That question hung there like smoke after an explosion. It wasn't malicious. It came from a place of genuine curiosity, perhaps even concern. In American training, we talk about sacrifice, but we frame it around mission accomplishment, force protection, overwhelming superiority. We train to win, to come home. But ready to die? That's not in our manuals. I write this now, years later, because that moment changed everything for me. It forced me to confront how I viewed the Philippine military, not as a junior partner needing our tech and tactics, but as something profoundly different. Their soldiers aren't trained to die. They're forged in a fire we Americans have largely avoided since Vietnam. They fought real insurgents on their soil for decades. Abu Sayyaf kidnappers, Mote extremists pledging to ISIS, Moro separatists with grudges going back generations. This confession is my attempt to set the record straight. No official report will capture what I saw in Mindanao, what I heard in that room, or how the Philippine Secretary's response humbled us all. It's about the gap between training for victory and being willing to pay the ultimate price, not because you're ordered to, but because the person next to you matters more than your own life. I've kept quiet too long. This is for the young officers on both sides who deserve to understand. Alliances aren't built on hardware alone. They're built on respect for what makes each of us fight. And in the Philippines, that what is something ancient, unbreakable, and utterly human.
The Philippines sits at the heart of the Indo-Pacific like a sentinel, archipelagic, vulnerable, yet indispensable. With over 7,600 islands strung across vital sea lanes, it's part of what strategists call the first island chain, a natural barrier stretching from Japan through Taiwan to Borneo. Control the waters around the Philippines, and you influence everything from trade routes carrying trillions in goods to potential flashpoints like Taiwan or the Spratlys. For the United States, the Philippines isn't just an ally, it's a cornerstone of our Indo-Pacific strategy. The 2022 Indo-Pacific Strategy document spells it out, one of 5 treaty allies in the region, alongside Japan, South Korea, Thailand, and Australia. Why the focus? Geography first. The Philippines guards the western approaches to the Pacific, its western shores facing the South China Sea, disputed waters where China has built militarized islands and harassed fishermen. Luzon, the northernmost major island, is less than 800 miles from Taiwan and even closer to potential conflict zones. Then there's history. The Mutual Defense Treaty of 1951 binds us. An attack on one is an attack on both. We fought together, from World War II, where Filipino guerrillas bled alongside Americans against the Japanese, to the post-9/11 era, when U.S. Special Forces advised in the hunt for Abu Sayyaf. But in recent years, as China's gray zone tactics intensified, water cannons on resupply boats, militia swarms around Scarborough Shoal, the alliance has deepened. The Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA, of 2014 allows rotational U.S. presence at Philippine bases. By 2023-2025, we've expanded to 9 sites, including northern ones facing Taiwan. The Philippine military, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, brings something unique, a fierce tradition of combat. Rooted in guerrilla warfare against Spanish, American, and Japanese occupiers, then decades of insurgency against communists and Moro separatists. Their soldiers know asymmetric war intimately. In Mindanao, they've battled Abu Sayyaf, kidnappers and bombers who pledged to ISIS, and the Mauti Group, who in 2017 nearly turned Marawi into a caliphate outpost. Key cooperation programs underscore this partnership. Balikatan, or Shoulder to Shoulder in Tagalog, is the flagship annual exercise, growing massive, over 17,000 participants in recent iterations involving live fire, amphibious ops, cyber defense, and humanitarian aid. Then there's the Joint U.S. Military Assistance Group, JUSMAG, advising on everything from logistics to training. Special Operations Forces, SOF cooperation has been crucial, with U.S. teams embedded in Operation Enduring Freedom Philippines, mentoring counterparts against terrorists. Politically, the atmosphere leading into high-level talks was charged. Under President Marcos Jr., Manila pivoted firmly towards Washington, expanding EDCA sites amid South China Sea incidents. Budget woes plagued the AFP, modernization delayed by pandemics and priorities, but spirit unmatched. Reports highlighted high casualty rates in counterinsurgency, yet recruitment never faltered. Americans worried about interoperability, Filipinos about sustainment. This context framed every discussion. America brings technology, air power, precision. The Philippines brings resolve, born of necessity. In a region where deterrence means credibility, the alliance's strength lies in blending both. But as I'd learned, credibility isn't just about weapons. It's about why soldiers fight. The Indo-Pacific isn't abstract to Filipinos. It's home, threatened daily. U.S. strategy recognizes this, empowering allies to lead regionally. Programs like the Indo-Pacific Maritime Security Initiative fund radars and patrols, yet beneath the acronyms, real tensions simmered, budget shortfalls forcing hard choices, political debates over sovereignty. In those pre-meeting briefings, we'd pore over maps, Philippine outposts in the West Philippine Sea, U.S. carriers transiting. Risk assessments painted grim pictures, high casualties if escalation hit remote islands. That's when the question of readiness loomed largest, not just equipment, but will. The AFP's history is one of adaptation, from Hukbalahap rebels post-World War II to New People's Army communists, then Islamic extremists. They've mastered jungle warfare, urban fights, community engagement. Bayanihan, the communal spirit, extends to military civic action, building schools while hunting terrorists. Contrast with U.S. forces, Post-Iraq, Afghanistan, we've shifted to great power competition, high-tech peer fights, fewer boots in endless insurgencies. Our training emphasizes force protection, overwhelming firepower to minimize losses. This difference, subtle in exercises, stark in reality, set the stage for that fateful meeting. Cooperation was strong, Balikatan evolving to include multilateral elements, SOF exchanges honing skills, but underlying it all, a question of what makes a soldier charge into fire. As an observer, I'd seen both worlds, American precision in planning, Filipino improvisation under fire. The alliance needed both. Yet, in quiet moments, I'd wonder, in a prolonged fight, who breaks first?
The conference room was in a secure wing of a joint facility. Let's say Manila for narrative's sake, though it could have been Honolulu. Polished wood table, projection screens, coffee urns steaming. Philippine and U.S. flags flanked a seal of the Mutual Defense Board. Seats arranged precisely. Americans on one side, Filipinos opposite, observers like me along the walls. The room hummed with subdued energy. Philippine officers in crisp barong or uniforms, medals from Mindanao campaigns. Americans in service dress, stars heavy on shoulders. The Secretary of National Defense, a civilian with military bearing, sat center for the Philippines. Opposite, a U.S. four-star, flanked by Indo-Pacific staff. Expressions told stories. Filipinos, polite smiles masking fatigue from endless ops. Americans, confident, but eyes betraying concern over metrics, readiness rates, equipment gaps. I noted the subtle worries. Philippine side glanced at budget slides, modernization hampered, ships aging. Americans nodded sympathetically but pushed for more joint patrols. Agenda progressed, updates on EDCA sites, Balikatan lessons. Then casualty reports from counterterrorism. Slides showed high AFP losses against Abu Sayyaf ambushes, Maute holdouts post-Marawi, and ISIS Philippines remnants. Numbers stark. Dozens killed in single engagements, ratios unfavorable without air support. The general, let's call him General Brooks, cleared his throat. He'd reviewed intel on Philippine ops, brave but costly advances. He asked, "What kind of military training do you provide to ensure your soldiers are ready to die for their country?" The room froze. A pin drop would have echoed. Coffee cups paused mid-air. Reactions rippled. Junior American officers shifted uncomfortably, question blunt. Senior Filipinos stiffened, eyes narrowing. The secretary's face, stone, then thoughtful. One Philippine colonel flushed, jaw tight. Pride stung. Another gazed distant, perhaps recalling lost comrades. An American admiral broke eye contact first, staring at notes. I felt heat rise. Question exposed raw nerve. Deeper reactions, a Philippine general, Marawi veteran, nodded slowly, understanding intent, but implication clear. Do they have what it takes? Silence stretched 10, 15 seconds, eternity in such rooms. That's when I knew this wasn't routine. This probed the soul of the alliance. As the silence stretched in that conference room, my mind fled thousands of miles south to Mindanao, the island where I'd spent more time embedded with Philippine troops than anywhere else in my career. I could almost smell the cordite again, hear the distant crack of sniper fire echoing through the lush green hell that is the southern Philippines. While the generals sat frozen, I was back in Marawi, 2017. The siege of Marawi lasted 5 months, but the moments that burned into me were compressed into days of unrelenting urban combat. ISIS-affiliated Maute and Abu Sayyaf fighters had seized the city center, turned mosques into fortresses, laced streets with IEDs, and vowed to create a wilayat, an ISIS province, right in Southeast Asia. The AFP, with U.S. advisory support kept carefully in the background, had to retake it block by block, room by room. I remember the briefings at the Philippine Marines Forward Command Post, maps covered in red grease pencil marking enemy strongpoints. The city was a maze of narrow alleys, concrete houses, and the shimmering Lake Lanao on one side. Philippine troops, many barely out of their teens, moved in small teams, supported by aging MD-520 helicopters and whatever air support could be scraped together. We Americans provided intelligence, targeting pods, and quiet advice, but the fighting was theirs. The destruction was apocalyptic. Artillery and airstrikes had reduced whole districts to rubble just to deny the enemy cover. I watched Philippine infantrymen advance through streets where every window could hide a sniper, every doorway a booby trap. They moved methodically, but the cost was visible in the stretchers carried back, in the blood trails on the pavement. One scene plays on repeat in my head. A young private, couldn't have been more than 20, spotted his squad mate take a round in the neck while crossing an open intersection. Without hesitation, the private sprinted into the kill zone, dragging his wounded comrade behind a burned-out car. Bullets snapped around him, kicking up dust. He pressed a bandage to the wound, called for a medic on the radio, all while returning fire with one hand. The wounded man lived. The private took shrapnel in the leg, but refused evacuation until his squad pushed forward another 2 blocks. Another memory, a Marine sergeant in a narrow alley, manning an M60 machine gun from a second-floor window. His team was pinned down by heavy fire from a mosque minaret. Instead of falling back, he stood exposed, belt after belt feeding through the gun, suppressing the enemy long enough for his men to flank. When the gun finally jammed from overheating, he switched to his rifle and kept shooting until an RPG round collapsed the wall on him. They found him later, still clutching the weapon, a faint smile on his face. His last radio transmission? "Cleared to advance, sir. We've got this." Then there was the Scout Ranger reconnaissance team I accompanied on a night infiltration. Their mission, clear a row of houses suspected to be rigged with explosives to open a route for the main assault. Intelligence said at least a dozen hardened fighters inside, plus possible hostages. The team leader, a captain with scars from previous campaigns, briefed his men quietly. No dramatics, no speeches about dying for country, just, we go in, we get our people out, we come home together if we can. They breached under cover of darkness. I stayed at the command post, monitoring drone feeds. What I saw on the screen still haunts me. Room after room cleared with grenades and precise fire. One ranger triggered a tripwire. Boom! The blast took his legs. Instead of panic, his teammates dragged him to cover, applied tourniquets, and continued the mission. They rescued 3 civilian hostages and neutralized the cell. Only afterward did they evacuate their wounded. The captain later told me, "We don't leave anyone behind, sir. Not civilians, not our own." These weren't isolated acts of heroism. They were the norm. Philippine soldiers routinely exposed themselves to save civilians trapped in crossfire, carried wounded comrades through kill zones, held positions long after ammunition ran low. Casualties were high, over 160 AFP killed, thousands wounded, but the city was retaken. What struck me hardest, what I only fully understood later, was the why. These men weren't brainwashed into seeking death. They weren't reciting slogans about dying gloriously. They were fighting for the person next to them, their squad mate from the same barangay, the brother in arms who shared canned sardines and stories of home during long patrols. I once asked a battle-weary lieutenant after a particularly bloody day why they kept pushing when retreat would have saved lives. He looked at me like I'd asked why he breathed. "Sir, if we fall back, the people behind us, the families in the next barrio pay the price, and my men, they're my family too." That was it. They weren't trained to die. They were raised by culture, by community, by a lifetime of seeing what happens when you abandon your own to protect the people standing beside them. Death wasn't the goal, it was the risk they accepted because the alternative, letting their brothers fall, letting civilians suffer, was unthinkable. In American doctrine, we emphasize mission accomplishment and force protection. Both are critical. But in Marawi, I saw something deeper. A bond so fierce that self-preservation took second place to collective survival. Bayanihan extended to the battlefield, the communal spirit of lifting together, carrying together, dying together if necessary. As I sat in that conference room years later, watching the Philippine officers absorb the American general's question, these images flooded back. I realized the question itself revealed a gulf. We Americans train to win and go home. They train through life, not just boot camp, to never abandon the fight, because abandonment means losing everything that matters. The silence after General Brooks's question felt endless, but it probably lasted less than a minute. All eyes turned to the Philippine Secretary of National Defense. He was a civilian appointee, but his bearing and the respect he commanded from the uniformed officers spoke volumes. He didn't flinch, he didn't bristle. He simply leaned forward, folded his hands, and began to speak, not with indignation, but with the quiet authority of someone who had buried too many soldiers. He did not answer the question directly at first. Instead, he told a story. In 2019, he began, voice steady, a company of Philippine Marines was tasked with holding a ridgeline in Sulu against the determined Abu Sayyaf assault. They were outnumbered, low on ammunition, and their resupply helicopter had been driven off by heavy fire. For 36 hours they held that position, not because it was tactically irreplaceable. On a map, another ridge could have served. They held it because below them, in the valley, were 3 barangays full of civilians who would have been massacred if the terrorists broke through. He paused, letting that sink in. Those Marines fought with rifles, grenades, and eventually bayonets. They called in artillery on their own position when the enemy overran the forward line. When it was over, more than half the company was dead or wounded. But the civilians lived. Not one was harmed. The secretary looked around the room, meeting eyes, American and Filipino alike. That, gentlemen, is the kind of training we provide. It is not in any manual you will find in Quantico or Fort Benning. It is not a block on leadership reaction courses or marksmanship qualifications. It is something passed down from generation to generation, from the Katipuneros who fought Spain with bolos, to the guerrillas who bled the Japanese dry, to the soldiers today who know that their country is not just lines on a map, it is the people they grew up with, the families waiting in the provinces. He leaned back slightly. So to answer your question, General, we do not train them to die. We train them to love something so strongly, family, community, the man beside them, that death becomes a risk they accept, not a goal they seek. The room remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not frozen shock, but absorption. General Brooks, the man who had asked the question, stared at the table for a long moment. Then he nodded, slowly, almost imperceptibly. A few American officers shifted in their seats. One colonel, a West Pointer I knew well, gave the faintest nod of understanding. Another, younger major, looked like he'd been struck by something he couldn't yet articulate. On the Philippine side, expressions softened. Pride, yes, but not triumphalism. More like relief that someone had finally said it plainly. I glanced at the Marine general across from me, a veteran of Marawi. His eyes were distant, but the corner of his mouth lifted in the smallest acknowledgement. The secretary had spoken for all of them. No one clapped, no one needed to. The answer hung in the air, heavier and more profound than any slide deck on readiness percentages or equipment modernization timelines. In that moment, the hierarchy in the room shifted, not officially, but viscerally. The Americans weren't the senior partner dispensing wisdom anymore. We were witnesses to something older, deeper, and in some ways more resilient than our own carefully engineered war-fighting machine. The secretary concluded quietly, "We fight with what we have, but we fight with everything we are." And with that, the meeting moved on, but nothing was the same afterward. For years, I had prided myself on understanding military training. I'd been through the U.S. Army's pipeline, Ranger School, Joint Special Operations courses, countless rotations at the National Training Center where we simulated peer-level conflict with overwhelming technological advantage. I'd also observed, advised, and even helped design parts of Philippine training programs during Balakatan and smaller exchanges. I thought I knew the differences, but the Secretary's answer forced me to go deeper, to truly dissect what separates the way we prepare soldiers in America from the way they do it in the Philippines. American training is a masterpiece of science and standardization. From basic combat training to advanced leader courses, everything is broken down into measurable blocks. Physical fitness, timed runs, push-ups, obstacle courses with pass-fail standards. Marksmanship, known distance ranges, stress shoots, transition drills. Tactics, crawl, walk, run progression, lanes training with pop-up targets and pyrotechnics. Psychological preparation, resilience modules, battlefield ethics classes, simulations that teach decision-making under uncertainty. We emphasize mission first, soldiers always. But in practice, mission accomplishment is achieved through superior firepower, intelligence, and force protection. Our goal is to win decisively while minimizing our own losses. Casualties are not accepted as inevitable. They're failures to be analyzed and prevented next time. We train soldiers to fight smart, to use drones, precision-guided munitions, networked communications, tools that allow one platoon to dominate a battlefield that would have required a battalion in previous wars. There is psychological screening, mental health support embedded in units, chaplains on speed dial. We talk openly about fear, about PTSD, about coming home. The unspoken contract is clear. Serve honorably, fight hard, and we will do everything in our power to bring you back alive. Philippine training, by contrast, has always struck me as more organic. Their basic military training is rigorous: marches through jungles, live fire exercises with limited ammunition, hand-to-hand combat that leaves bruises. But much of their real preparation happens not in classrooms or on ranges, but in the field. Year after year of actual counterinsurgency operations. A young Philippine soldier might spend his first tour in Sulu or Mindanao chasing Abu Sayyaf through triple canopy jungle with nothing but an M16, a few magazines, and the man next to him. There is no overwhelming air support on demand, no constant drone overwatch. Ammunition is rationed. Medevac might take hours. They learn quickly that survival depends not just on individual skill, but on the cohesion of the squad, the platoon, the company. Values are woven into everything, but not through PowerPoint slides on core values. They're transmitted through stories told around campfires, through civic action missions where soldiers build schools in the same villages they patrol, through the simple fact that most enlisted men come from the very communities they defend. Family is never abstract. A soldier's motivation isn't just patriotism in the grand sense, it's literally protecting his cousins, his old neighborhood, the girl he left back home. This is where the concept of Bayanihan, that deep Filipino tradition of communal unity and mutual help, becomes military doctrine without ever being written down. When a unit is surrounded, they don't think in terms of acceptable loss ratios. They think, if we break, the people behind us suffer. If we abandon this hill, the next village falls. If I run, my brother dies. I've watched American-trained units, ours and others, execute flawless bounding overwatch, suppressing and maneuvering with textbook precision. I've also watched Philippine units do things no American commander would order. A squad voluntarily holding a position with no ammunition left, using rocks and bayonets because retreat would expose civilians. Both approaches work in their context, but which is stronger when the context is prolonged, asymmetric, existential? Discipline-based loyalty versus emotion-rooted loyalty, that's the core difference. American loyalty is professional, built on contracts, oaths, shared standards, pride in the institution. It is powerful, reliable, and scalable across a massive all-volunteer force drawn from a huge nation. Philippine loyalty is visceral, rooted in personal relationships, family ties, community bonds.
It can be chaotic, harder to command at scale, more prone to localism, but when the chips are down, it produces a ferocity that is almost impossible to break. I've seen Philippine soldiers continue fighting with wounds that would have had American troops on a medevac bird. Not because they're tougher individuals, though many are, but because leaving would mean abandoning people they love in a way that transcends unit patches. As an advisor who trained both, I can say this: American methods produce soldiers who win battles through superior systems. Philippine methods produce soldiers who refuse to lose wars because losing means losing everything they are. There is no clear better. In a high-intensity conventional fight with full U.S. support, I'd want American-trained forces every time. In a grinding, decades-long insurgency where the enemy lives among the people and technology is limited, I've seen Philippine spirit carry the day when equipment and numbers should have dictated defeat. The real question is when sacrifice becomes the only option left. Americans sacrifice when the mission demands it and no better alternative exists. Filipinos seem to reach that point sooner, not because they seek death, but because their threshold for what constitutes unacceptable is different. For them, abandoning the fight is often more unacceptable than dying. In the end, both systems work because both systems produce soldiers willing to risk their lives. But only one system seems to produce soldiers who, deep down, have already accepted that risk long before they ever put on the uniform.
I've never forgotten the first time I saw a Philippine soldier cry openly on the battlefield. It was during the Marawi campaign in a makeshift aid station set up in a half-collapsed school. A young corporal had just learned that his best friend, someone he'd known since childhood, enlisted with, trained with, was killed while clearing the next building. The corporal was wounded himself, shrapnel in his arm, but he sat on a crate, head in his hands, sobbing without shame while medics worked on others around him. American soldiers grieve too. I've seen it, felt it myself in Iraq and Afghanistan. But there was something raw, unfiltered about this. No attempt to maintain composure for the sake of the team. No, I'm fine, just get me back out there. Just pure human devastation. Later, when the tears stopped, that same corporal picked up his rifle, checked his magazines, and asked his platoon sergeant when they were pushing forward again. The shift was jarring. Grief didn't weaken him, it seems to fuel him. I've also seen the reverse. American operators, hardened Green Berets and SEALs embedded as advisors, reacting with something close to shock at the willingness of Philippine Special Forces to take risks. During one operation in Basilan, a Philippine Scout Ranger team volunteered to assault a fortified Abu Sayyaf camp at dawn with minimal fire support. The American team lead tried to talk them into waiting for an airstrike. The Ranger captain just smiled and said, "Sir, if we wait, they escape into the villages. Better we go now." They went. They took casualties. They destroyed the camp and rescued hostages. Afterward, one of the Americans pulled me aside, voice low. "These guys are insane. Brave as hell, but insane." I didn't know how to respond then. I do now. It wasn't insanity. It was a different calculus of risk. No military wants its soldiers to die. Every commander, American or Filipino, wakes up praying today isn't the day he has to write those letters home. We all train to minimize losses, to fight smarter, to use technology and tactics to tilt the odds. But there are moments, on remote islands, in narrow alleys, when the enemy is closing in and resupply isn't coming, where someone has to hold the line long enough for the bigger plan to work. In those moments, only willingness to pay the ultimate price keeps the line from breaking. I've started asking myself hard questions in the years since that meeting. Has the American military, with all our advantages, begun to lose something essential? We've become so good at protecting our own that we rarely face the kind of existential choices Philippine troops face routinely. Our soldiers are professionals, volunteers who expect to come home. That's a strength,
but is it also a vulnerability? When I think about a potential high-end fight in the Indo-Pacific, missile barrages, contested logistics, islands cut off for weeks, do we still have the same depth of resolve? Or have we become so dependent on technological overmatch that we've forgotten how to fight when the satellites go dark and the supply ships can't get through? I don't have answers, only unease. The Philippine soldier fights knowing he might be the last line between chaos and the people he loves. The American soldier fights knowing the most powerful military in history has his back. Both are brave, both are necessary. But watching Philippine troops over the years, I've come to wonder if there's something irreplaceable in growing up in a country that has never had the luxury of overwhelming power. Something that forges a spirit we Americans might need to relearn if the next war doesn't go according to plan.
I have to confess something now that I've never said aloud. Not to my commanders, not to my wife, not even to myself in the mirror for a long time. For years, I looked down on the armed forces of the Philippines. Not openly, of course, never in briefings or reports. I was the professional observer, polite, encouraging, full of suggestions on how to improve logistics, fire support coordination, small unit tactics, but deep down, in the quiet arrogance that comes from serving in the world's most powerful military, I saw them as the junior partner. Brave, yes. Tenacious, absolutely, but ultimately limited by budget, by equipment, by a training pipeline that couldn't match the sophistication of ours. I pitied them a little. I thought they took high casualties because they had to, because they lacked the tools and doctrine to do it the right way, the American way. I was wrong, profoundly, embarrassingly wrong. Real strength in a military isn't measured by the number of fifth-generation fighters or the size of the defense budget. It isn't even about how cleanly you can execute a combined arms operation on a training range. Real strength is measured by what your soldiers are willing to do when no one is watching, when resupply isn't coming, when the smart choice, the survivable choice, is to pull back. And in that measure, the Philippine soldier has no equal that I have ever seen. I realized this gradually, through 100 small moments in Mindanao, but one incident shattered the last of my illusions. It was near the end of a long operation in central Mindanao, chasing a mixed Abu Sayyaf BIF cell that had been ambushing patrols. A young Philippine Army private, 19, maybe 20, from a poor farming family in the Visayas, volunteered to be point man on a night movement to contact. Intelligence said the enemy was dug in on a ridge, possibly with hostages. As we approached, just a small reconnaissance element with me tagging along as advisor, the point man triggered an ambush. Fire erupted from 3 sides. He went down immediately, hit multiple times. What happened next unfolded in seconds, but felt like slow motion. His squad leader reacted instantly, suppressive fire, bounding back to cover, but the private was still out there, in the open, alive but bleeding badly. His squad leader started organizing a recovery under fire. Then the private, voice weak over the radio, said something that stopped everyone cold. "Sir, don't risk the others. Tell my mother. Tell her I did the right thing. Tell her I love her." Then he keyed the mic again. "I'll keep their heads down. Go around the left flank." And he did. Wounded, dying, he crawled forward, firing his rifle in controlled bursts, drawing fire onto himself to give his team the opening they needed. They flanked, overran the position, rescued the hostages, and recovered his body. He was gone by the time they reached him. I stood there in the aftermath, watching his teammates wrap him in a poncho, their faces blank with shock and grief. No one spoke for a long time. That kid didn't die because of poor training. He didn't die because of bad tactics or lack of body armor. He died because he chose, deliberately, consciously, to put his team, the mission, and the civilians they were there to protect above his own life. And he did it without drama, without a speech, just a quiet message to his mother.
In that moment, every metric I had used to judge the Philippine military, readiness rates, equipment lists, casualty ratios, felt obscene. Who was I to offer advice on improving a force that produced young men capable of that? I never told anyone how that night changed me. I filed my after-action observations, praised their aggressiveness, recommended more night vision goggles. But inside, something broke. My certainty about what made a military strong cracked wide open. Real power isn't in the hardware. It's in the will of the 19-year-old who decides that some things are worth than coming home. I had underestimated them. I had underestimated what it means to fight not with everything you're given, but with everything you are. That private's last words still echo in my head. They are the reason I'm writing this now, because someone needs to say it plainly. The armed forces of the Philippines may not have the newest ships or the biggest budget, but they have something far rarer. They have soldiers who have already made peace with dying if it means the people they love get to live free. And that is a strength no amount of money can buy.
The meeting didn't end with applause or dramatic handshakes. It simply moved on. The next agenda item was logistics sustainment, then a discussion of upcoming exercises. But the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. People spoke more carefully, listened more intently. Slides on equipment shortfalls were met with genuine offers of assistance rather than polite nods. When the session finally broke for coffee, General Brooks, the four-star who had asked the fateful question, didn't join the cluster of officers around the urn. Instead, he slipped out into the hallway alone. I happened to be stepping out for air at the same moment and saw him standing by a window, hands clasped behind his back, staring at nothing. He didn't notice me at first. Then, almost to himself, he muttered, "That answer. I'm going to remember that for the rest of my life." He said it quietly, almost reverently. There was no embarrassment in his voice, no defensiveness, just acknowledgement. I pretended I hadn't heard and walked past, but the words stayed with me. Later, as people filed out, I watched the Philippine Secretary of National Defense gather his folders. A young American major approached him, hesitant, respectful, and asked a question about training philosophy. The secretary smiled, not triumphant, but warm. "We fight with what we have," he said simply, echoing his earlier words, "but we fight with everything we are." No lectures, no moral superiority, just truth. In the weeks and months that followed, I noticed subtle changes. American planners began emphasizing human factors more in their assessments of Philippine units. Recommendations shifted from needs more equipment to leverage existing strengths in unit cohesion. Joint training incorporated more scenarios where overwhelming firepower wasn't available, scenarios that played to Philippine experience. Nothing official, of course, no memos titled Lessons in Will, but the respect was there now, quiet and real. That day didn't fix budget shortfalls or close capability gaps. It didn't change geopolitics, but it changed people. It changed me. To the young soldiers reading this, American, Filipino, or from any allied force, listen carefully. Sacrifice is never taught in a classroom. You won't find it in a field manual, a PowerPoint slide, or a resilience training module. No drill sergeant can order it into you. No psychological evaluation can predict it. It comes from something deeper, from believing, truly believing, that there are things, people, places, ideals worth protecting at any cost. It comes from loving something more than your own life. For the Philippine soldier, that something is often tangible. The family waiting in the province, the childhood friend in the next foxhole, the civilians huddled in a barangay church while bullets fly overhead. Their courage isn't abstract patriotism, it's personal, visceral, immediate. For the American soldier, it may be different. Duty, the Constitution, the idea of freedom carried across the world.
Our tradition is one of volunteers who fight far from home, backed by unmatched power. That too is noble, powerful, and necessary. But wherever you serve, remember this. When technology fails, when plans collapse, when the enemy is at the gate and no reinforcement is coming, only one thing decides who holds and who breaks. It is not the weapon in your hand, it is the reason in your heart. To the officers, lieutenants planning your first missions, colonels briefing your staffs, generals shaping strategy, never forget that technology, no matter how advanced, is only a multiplier. It amplifies will. It does not replace it. Drones don't hold ground. Satellites don't comfort the wounded. Precision munitions don't inspire a 19-year-old to crawl forward under fire so his team can live. People do. In an era of hypersonics and cyber warfare, of AI targeting and autonomous systems, it is tempting to believe that the human element is becoming obsolete, that future wars will be won by algorithms and standoff strikes with minimal risk to our own. Do not believe it. History shows otherwise. From the trenches of World War I to the jungles of Vietnam, from the streets of Marawi to the mountains of Afghanistan, wars are ultimately decided by the person on the ground who refuses to yield. The strongest alliances are not built on shared weapon systems alone. They are built on mutual respect. Respect for how each partner fights, why they fight, and what they are willing to give. I have seen American and Philippine troops train side by side in Balikatan, laughing together after a long day of live fire exercises, sharing meals of rice and adobo mixed with MREs. In those moments, the differences in equipment fade. What remains is shared humanity. Respect that humanity in your allies. Learn from it. Never assume your way is the only way or even the best way in every circumstance. To the strategists and planners in Washington, Honolulu, Manila, and beyond, when you assess partner capacity, look beyond the spreadsheets. Look at the intangibles, the things that cannot be quantified, but decide everything. A military that fights with everything it has may lack the newest ships, but it will never lack defenders. A military that fights with everything it is cannot be broken by superior firepower alone. That is the lesson I carry from a conference room where one question changed how I see war, alliances, and the soldiers who wage both. Cherish your allies, not just for what they can do with your support, but for what they do every day without it. And to every reader, if you ever find yourself in a position to judge another military, another culture's way of war, pause. Remember the private who died drawing fire so his team could live. Remember the Marines who held a ridge for 36 hours to save villages they had never met. Remember that courage has many faces, and none of them come from a factory. That is the message I leave you with.
I began this confession with a question that froze a room of high-ranking officers. I end it with an answer that has haunted and humbled me ever since. I have sat through countless briefings, read thousands of pages of doctrine, observed exercises on 3 continents. I have seen war from the relative safety of advisory positions and command posts. But I have never found a better explanation, no manual, no study, no lecture that captures the essence of what I witnessed in the armed forces of the Philippines than the one given that day by their Secretary of National Defense. We do not train our soldiers to die. We train them to love something so fiercely that they will accept death before they accept defeat. That is the answer not found in any war college curriculum, any NATO standardization agreement, any joint publication. No one trains people to die. But there are those who are raised by family, by community, by a lifetime of knowing what abandonment costs, to never run, to never leave a comrade behind, to never let the innocent pay the price. And that is why when the moment comes, they are ready to give everything.
That is why they win even when the odds say they should lose. That is the quiet, unbreakable strength I underestimated for too long. And that is the reason I will always respect, deeply, profoundly, the soldiers of the Philippines. This confession is over, but the lesson, I hope, endures.